Aeliana let out a strange growl as she trudged through the sands of Jakku. She hated desert planets. They were hot, devoid of life, and only inhabited by the Hutts looking to capitalize off the waste left by the Republic. Jakku was no different. In fact, it was more infested with Hutts than ever after the Galactic Civil War ended and Star Destroyers were left all over the planet. Unfortunately for Aeliana, Jakku was also the closest place to Odessa with a scrap dealer, which she was finding herself in increasing need of as her ship continued to age. She glanced back at the dwindling silhouette of the Fury, an old Sith Empire ship that she'd grown too fond of to throw away for her own good. That ship was going to be the end of her one of these days, and the sand in her shoes scratching up her legs only told her that today just might be the day. She turned her attention back to Nema Outpost and continued, trudging her way through the sand, once again cursing her attachment to the Fury. The ship was simply too recognizable to be landed closer to the outpost. The Empire and the First Order hadn't bothered to change their aesthetic design, and the Fury looked too much like an enlarged TIE ship to be expected not to draw attention. As such, she was forced to walk the large distance through the dunes and sand of Jakku. You know what? She said to herself as she kicked her foot into the dune, kicking up a cloud of sand. I really hate this stuff. It was an hour before Aeliana made it to Nema Outpost, and the first thing she did was find herself something to refill her water tankard with. There was no shortage of people willing to trade water, but they always wanted something of value instead of typical Hutt currency. Currency was flimsy out here in backwater worlds, especially when there was little to buy with it. Even Nema's own goons traded in ration packs, sealed packages of polystarch and veg meat that provided a lot of nutrition at relatively low cost. They were made for soldiers, but for the hungry and desperate scavengers of Jakku, they were worth more than Electrum. Hence why money was of little use out here, and the only thing of value Aeliana had clipped to her belt and far too dangerous in the hands of anyone not equipped to, and the only thing of value Aeliana had was clipped to her belt and far too dangerous in the hands of anyone not equipped to handle it. No, trading her lightsaber was out of the question. If her mother could have seen her even entertain the idea, she'd have never heard the end of it. Aeliana had supplies on the ship and tradable goods. In a pinch, she could always barter with what she had on the ship and return to fetch it. But for now, she needed to find someone willing to trade. She did manage to fill her water tanker by stealing ration packs from the concession area and trading them to a moisture farmer. It was crude, but it would make the trek back to the Fury all the easier, and besides, the Hutts had plenty of money and resources. They could handle a few skimmed ration packs. Or a lot of skimmed ration packs, Aeliana thought as she briefly considered swiping the lot and handing them out like candy. It would certainly help the funny looks, at least. With a heavy sigh, she made her way to the scrap dealer. Not a lot sold on Nema Outpost. It was mostly a place for scavengers to turn in their finds. But enough of them had speeders that it became worthwhile to keep some stock for sale. This, of course, only attracted smugglers, hermits, and Aeliana herself to the planet to get universal ship parts for cheap. She approached the miserable-looking human sat at the scrap table. "Morning, Treg," she said cheerfully. Treg was a lovely soul, a helpful dealer who always managed to help Aeliana find exactly what she needed, with a little persuading at the very least. Treg looked up and his face wrinkled in disgust when he saw her. "What do you want, Sith?" "Did I say lovely soul? I meant rat." Aeliana rolled her eyes and sat down. "I need a hyperdrive coil. The Fury's on its last legs and I can't get a new one. I'm not going to be doing many more jumps now, am I?" Treg snorted and looked back down at the scrap, trying to scrub the dirt off a capacitor. One-stranded Sith? Sounds like the galaxy is already a better place. He looked back down at his junk pile and continued sorting through it. That's where things get bad for you, Treg," Aeliana smirked, "because a stranded Sith hanging around your outpost is pretty bad for business. I mean, with all this sensitive equipment, it would just be terrible if there was." She extended a finger and a jolt of force lightning zapped a few small components, causing them to spark and explode. "An accident." Treg growled at her, but didn't retaliate. She learned the hard way not to cross Aeliana when she needed something. "Look, even if I wanted to help you, I don't have a hyperdrive coil. You're just going to have to look around and see if a scavenger is feeling generous." Aeliana looked around the outpost, grungy, dirty, and the perfect picture to go alongside the word rust heap. The scavengers of Nema Outpost didn't fare very well. The huts kept them busy tearing apart the crashed ships for scraps of rations, and those that didn't die in the desert always looked like they were close to keeling over from sheer exhaustion and hunger. This didn't mean that scavengers could be easily bought. This did mean that scavengers could be easily bought, more so than the huts. A good full meal and a few free ration packs, and most of the scavengers would gladly part with anything. On more than one occasion, Eliana had managed to get a hold of expensive parts for her ship simply by giving a scavenger enough food to last them a week. Just a few years ago, in fact, when she was just a teenager, Eliana had come to Jakku with her mother and had spent most of the day with a very young and very distraught-looking scavenger who seemed to struggle to pull parts of a down speeder. It was probably one of the only times during those days that Eliana had risked drawing her lightsaber on a planet as she sliced parts off the speeder and handed them to the girl. She'd even left her a plasma torch to cut parts off herself when it was time to leave. It was a nice time. That girl had apparently died from starvation after too many unproductive days. Went down to 130. Nobody, people were like, stop reading. Sighing, Eliana stood up and made her way to the concession area, hoping to find someone willing to trade a hyperdrive coil, or who even had one. 2 hours into her search, and she was already in luck. Eliana was certain she'd be on Jakku, shaking down scavengers for the better part of a week. A young human girl was standing in a lineup to turn in her scrap, and on the tray she was dragging was a hyperdrive coil. The Sith eyed the girl curiously as she kept looking around the concession area, as if trying to keep tabs on every single person walking around. It was odd behavior, Eliana thought. It seemed as though scavengers on Jakku kept their hands to themselves and didn't try to steal each other's scrap. Eliana had to admit that, for a scavenger who was covered in dirt, sweat, and grime, she was exceptionally pretty. Her hair was tied back in tight buns, and her tunic was tied in a very flattering fashion around her. Eliana's eyes trailed down to her arms, noticing how firm and toned they were. Hauling parts all day, every day would certainly make someone quite strong. Eliana was almost sure that the girl could lift her easily if she tried. She usually didn't approach scavengers until they were offered a meager price by Unkar Plut, so she could swoop in with a much better offer. She counted herself lucky that the scavengers dealt in ration packs because she was always stocked to the teeth with them. They were quick, cheap, and came in handy if you were stranded on a planet waiting to fix your ship. She'd learned the hard way to always have a large stock on the Fury. It was almost laughable that the huts shortchanged the scavengers so heavily, because ration packs cost less than a credit to make. Eliana could spend a few hundred credits and simply destroy the hut's entire operation if she wanted to. There's Def Beats Reddit videos for sleepy time content. I'm glad. Jakku was a scam of the highest caliber. The huts rake in money from salvage parts, and the scavengers are forced to beg for less than crumbs. Were she in a better position to do something about it, she'd have Plut's head mounted on the front of the Fury by now. The girl had finally approached the counter and hefted the hyperdrive coil up for Plut to see. Plut looked at it over and then frowned before offering the girl a half portion of a ration pack for the coil and everything else on her cart. Oh god, what happened? I disconnected from the chat. Oh, I'm good. Now was her chance. Excuse me, she called out to the girl, who turned to her with a startled look on her face. I'll offer you a better deal for your hyperdrive coil. And what sort of deal is that? The girl asked, looking at her suspiciously. Eliana couldn't deny the girl was strikingly beautiful. Soft features, striking brown eyes, hair that looked much too soft for the climate she lived in, despite it being mostly tied back. And the brief moment Eliana took to gander, a cheesy line regarding desert jewels entered her mind. She internally slapped herself for being distracted and refocused her attention. I'll feed you a proper meal and give you 14 double ration packs. Eliana smiled. All I ask in return is the coil, for you to come to my ship and install it, and your name. The girl's eyes went wide. That's an entire month's worth of food. I really need that coil, Eliana smiled, and I'm not so good with the machines. Deal, the girl said excitedly, holding out her hand. My name is Ray. You got a last name, Ray? Eliana asked, taking her hand and shaking it. Something in Ray's eyes went dark at the question, and Eliana realized she must have touched a nerve. I don't know what it is. Fair enough. Eliana nodded, desperately looking to regain a favorable footing in the conversation. I'm Eliana Benico. My ship is parked a mile out from the outpost. I have a speeder, Ray nodded, slinging her pack and staff over her back. Oh, you are my hero. Aeliana laughed as she followed Ray out to the outer edge of the outpost. I was not looking forward to another walk through the desert. Why didn't you just park your ship on the landing pads with the others? Ray asked, looking back at Aeliana with confusion. She couldn't comprehend why someone would trudge an hour through the sand, someone wearing as much black as Aeliana was, no less. My ship's design is too similar to First Order vessels. Last thing I need is a bunch of panicked scavengers hurling junk at me. Are you from the Confederacy? Ray asked. I'm independent. Jedi? Why would you think that? Ray only tilted her head towards Aeliana's waist where her lightsaber was hanging. Aeliana, with the speed of 1,000 rehearsals, replied, No, that doesn't work. It's just a good bluff. She wasn't entirely certain why she was lying. She never lied about the fact that she was Sith before, but something deep within her compelled her to conceal the truth this time. Smart, Ray smiled, as the two mounted the speeder and took off toward the desert. Ray almost couldn't believe her luck. The coil was a valuable find, and she had been incensed that Plutt would offer so little for such a valuable piece. She was about to curse him out for his greed when this off-worlder had swooped in with a better deal, almost as if she was watching her in waiting. She had been. Even if Ray hadn't seen her, she could practically feel the woman's eyes boring through her, and strangely enough, she was convinced the stranger had been checking her out. She didn't know why she thought that, she just had a feeling about it. Whatever, Ray thought. For a month of food, this off-worlder could stare at her as much as she wanted. Admittedly, she'd been nervous when she finally saw the Fury. Aeliana hadn't been lying when she... Or so much better in the original film, I'm hooked. Aeliana hadn't been lying when she said it resembled First Order ships too much. In fact, to the untrained eye, the two would be one and the same. But Ray had dismantled Imperial ships and First Order ships before, and this particular design was in neither of their registries. But she now fully understood Aeliana's worry about landing too close to Nema Outpost. She would be inviting hostility and possibly violence by doing so. Ray had expected the ship to come from some time before the Clone Wars, but after examining the hyperdrive and cringing at the sheer age of many of its parts, it was clear it was considerably older than that. Based on the fuel converters alone, she concluded the Fury was 3,000 years old. It was in terrible condition for a modern ship, but for a ship so old it was practically pristine. Unfortunately, it was also poorly maintained. Aeliana either wasn't the kind of person to maintain her ship, or didn't know how. Considering how she mentioned that machines eluded her, the latter was probably the most likely. Where exactly did you get this ship, anyway? It's an old family heirloom, Aeliana said, sitting on a crate and watching Ray work. Must be nice, Ray said somewhat bitterly. Family not the bequeathing type? I don't know. I'll have to ask them when they come back. When might that be? I don't know. Never knew them? How'd you guess? The lack of a last name tipped me off, Aeliana said, getting off the crate and sitting down beside her as she worked. So how'd you end up on Jakku? If it's all the same to you, I'd rather not recite my life story to a stranger, Ray huffed as she kicked the hydro spanner toward herself. I'd rather just do the job you're paying me to. Ray could hear Aeliana fall quiet and then get up to leave. She was glad to have some quiet, but she could feel something, like a wave of disappointment had washed over her. She slid out from under the hyperdrive just in time to see Aeliana round the corner looking at the floor. What an odd woman, she muttered, sliding back under the hyperdrive. All in all, this was a productive day for Aeliana. Her ship was fixed in record time, and the hyperdrive was purring like a kitten. This Ray had quite a knack for ships, and Aeliana had barely finished cooking when she came in saying she was finished. The girl had even fine-tuned the hyperdrive and cleaned out most of its parts for good measure, and Aeliana was convinced that she'd just been given a rare blessing by the Force. This is officially canon for me. I'm so glad about that. As she set a plate down in front of her, Aeliana took in the scavenger's appearance. She was smeared with engine grease, and her hair had come free from its knots in places. Aeliana had never found the mechanic look particularly attractive before, but she was finding herself unable to take her eyes off Ray. Finish this chapter and then go to bed. Aeliana blinked, having caught herself becoming distracted by the pretty girl yet again. I'll have your ration packs ready after you've eaten, she said, sitting down in front of her. Thank you, Ray nodded, taking a bite before freezing in place. Wow, this is delicious. You made this? Before Aeliana could respond, a robotic voice chimed in. Darth Amorosa is quite an experienced chef indeed. Aeliana whirled around to see her least favorite stowaway, 2VR8, a protocol droid that came with the ship and was likely just as old. She kept the droid around because without him she wouldn't have been able to run the ship, and after 10 years and nobody else around, 2V had become the closest thing to family she had. For all his irritations, she loved that droid. Alas, she should have known it would have jumped at the chance to praise her whenever the opportunity arose. Ray almost choked on her next mouthful at the droid's words. I'm sorry, Darth Amorosa? Thinking quickly, Aeliana put on Thinking quickly, Eliana put on an annoyed face and looked at the droid. Damn thing's got a faulty memory core. Keeps getting me mixed up with one of its previous masters. Previous master? Rey asked, looking suspicious. Droid's old. About as old as a ship. They weren't always family heirlooms, and I guess they used to belong to a Sith named Amorosa at some point. And that was when the droid's memory core started to experience issues. That's my best guess, and sadly I can never find compatible parts for him. It wasn't completely a lie. The ship was old, as was 2VR8, but Eliana's family had managed to keep him in reasonably good condition. She was hoping that it was convincing enough to keep Rey from pressing for more details. Oh my, have I offended, Master? 2V asked. I'm ever so sorry. My name is Eliana. Now get out of here. 2V left without another word, and Rey shrugged and continued eating. She was no stranger to faulty droids, and older droids had a hard time with names and identities, so she thought nothing else of it. If the droid was as old as the ship, they both likely had a long history of previous owners. Internally, Eliana let out a massive sigh of relief. While she wasn't particularly choosy about who she let in on the knowledge of who she was, in fact she pridefully announced herself as the Dark Lady of the Sith at times, she was still cautious with first impressions. She was quite frankly lucky that Trey could not seem fit to out her to the rest of the outpost. It only ever caused problems for her and alienated people she needed to stay on good terms with. She'd once made the mistake of answering a hail with her Sith name and had been chased across half the galaxy by a Resistance frigate for a month straight. She shuddered at the memory. It was the closest thing she'd come to being blasted into space, and she was still nervous about it around Resistance ships to this day. Nevertheless, her caution only extended so far. If she was going to be killed for being a Sith, then she faced such a death without fear. But there was something about this girl. Initially, Eliana had planned to smooth-talk Rey into bed with her for the night and send her off in the morning. She'd done it so many times that it was practically second nature, but the more they spoke, the more uneasy she felt about it. It was as if, now that she'd gotten to know her, she didn't want to just sleep with her and throw her out the door. That was part of the reason she concealed her identity. The more they talked, the more she liked this girl. So what do you do? Rey asked, looking up from her plate. Eliana jolted as she was pulled from her thoughts and momentarily blanked. Do a little bit of everything, really. Mercenary, bounty hunting, deliveries, wet work, anything I could do to get by, really. Rey choked again and dropping her plate onto the seat beside her and pounding her fist against her chest. Wet work? All my targets are first order, Eliana assured her. Republic SIS has a lot of people out there picking off stormtroopers and officers. They actually have a bounty out on Kylo Ren, but not a lot of people want to take the job. Why not? Rey asked, sitting forward. She was always interested in news from the galaxy, especially regarding the latest galactic war. Ren's a dark Jedi, Eliana explained. With the Force and a working lightsaber, you're a dangerous target. Back during the Clone Wars, the Jedi became famous for being one-man armies that left trails of bodies in their wake. I thought the Jedi were the Guardians of Peace, Rey asked, looking puzzled. Why are they leaving bodies? How do you think you guard peace? Eliana asked. A lightsaber isn't meant to be a flashlight. Rey thought about Eliana's question for a moment, then nodded. She wanted to argue, but couldn't really think of how one was supposed to be a guardian of peace during wartime, other than to win said war. So, have you met any Jedi in your travels? Eliana had to resist the urge to bristle at the question. Brushing a strand of thick, wavy brown hair out of her face, she put on a face of indifference. She put on a mask of indifference. Can't say I have, she replied. They were all wiped out after the First Order started to rise up. Rey narrowed her eyes slightly. For whatever reason, she didn't feel satisfied with Eliana's answer, or rather, unconvinced. It's just, she started, you seem to know a lot about them. I'm well read, Eliana said plainly. How much? It was Eliana's turn to narrow her eyes at Rey. You pressed me on this right after saying you'd rather not recite your life story to a total stranger? Rey felt her next words die in her mouth as she looked down on the plate she set aside. Fair enough, she said. Eliana felt a slight twinge of guilt at Rey's rather deflated expression. Did you want seconds, before you go? Rey's face lit right back up. Oh, yes, please. I mean, so long as you're offering, I wouldn't want to impose. Eliana smiled. No imposition at all. I'll be right back, she said, making her way back to the kitchen. When she returned, the two continued to talk as they ate. Topics range from the First Order to the ways to upgrade to the Fury to be a more reliable modern ship. As they spoke, Aeliana found herself quite liking Rey. It was rare she got to converse with someone on such a personal level where it almost seemed like they were friends. Usually it was potential employers and security she mostly spoke to. Maz Kanata, maybe, but that old pirate seemed more like an elder than anything else. Rey was like Aeliana's polar opposite in every possible way. A gearhead where Aeliana was a scholar, a scavenger where Aeliana was a freelancer. About the only thing they had in common was the fact that Aeliana could sense that the Force was strong with Rey. Sadly, she couldn't broach that topic without revealing herself. When Rey finally packed up her things to leave, Aeliana handed her container filled with double ration packs. She didn't tell her, but Aeliana had actually put 30 packs into the container rather than the 14 they had agreed upon. They shook hands, and Aeliana stood on the ramp of the Fury as she watched Rey speed off back into the desert. Aeliana remained on the ramp long after Rey had gotten out of sight, mulling over the day. It had been nice to have Rey around for the last few hours, and she quietly hoped that if she ever came back to Jakku, that she would see her again. Rey had been helpful, talkative, friendly, and Aeliana was embarrassed to admit she couldn't take her eyes off her. She was almost certain that Rey would have caught her blushing if... Oh God, this was an awkward sentence. She was almost certain that Rey would have caught her blushing if it was even... She was almost certain that Rey would have caught her blushing if it was possible to show.
Can you blush?
Here we go, Poppy.
That's crazy!
I did not think that line through. Need to go back and fix that. Sighing, she turned to go back inside and prep the ship for launch when a sudden wave of terror, hatred, and death washed over her. She was so overwhelmed by it she fell to her knees on the ramp. Then, as quickly as it had come, it vanished. Aeliana recognized it instantly. She felt the murder of a lot of people coming from the direction of Tuanul. The village that worshipped the Force and were always trying to rebuild the Jedi. Aeliana had always tried to stay clear of the village. She never would have assumed she would be welcome around people who allied themselves with the Jedi as much as she was always curious about the village's people. Getting to her feet, Aeliana hurried inside and prepped the Fury for launch. Jedi cult or no, she wasn't about to just ignore what she'd felt. Aeliana stepped off the Fury and was struck cold by what she saw. The village was in ruins. Bodies were scattered everywhere. An X-Wing fighter was burning on the outskirts of the village. None of the corpses seemed to have any weapons or appeared to be militant or hire thugs. As such, she can only conclude that the village had no real defenses with which to fight back. It was a proper one-sided massacre. But worst of all, she could feel the dark side of the Force lingering in the air. It was faint. Whoever had done this was clearly inexperienced, but she knew this was done by a Force user. Taking a deep breath and preparing herself for the worst, the Sith drew her lightsaber and cut through the fallen barricades of the village. There had to be someone still alive. Her lightsaber remained active as she scoured the village for any signs of life or even a clue as to what had happened. The sand shimmered a bright red in the glow of her lightsaber as her eyes darted to every inch they could see. Almost everyone was dead, but she could sense a brief life still flickering. Through her persistence, she finally found it, an old man curled up in the sand. She hurried over to him and held her lightsaber aloft so that she could see his face. "What happened here?" she asked, examining his wounds. A large, smoldering gash could be seen right across his chest. There was no mistaking it. He'd been cut deep by a lightsaber. There was nothing she could do for him. A cut this deep and wide was fatal. The old man coughed and looked up at her. The First Order. Aeliana huffed. She should have known. What did they want? Skywalker. They took Resistance pilot. Aeliana quickly tried to piece together everything the man was saying. The First Order was looking for a Skywalker. That had to have been Luke Skywalker and the old Jedi Master. And they took a Resistance pilot? What for? The Resistance had no idea where Skywalker was. Nobody did. Then it dawned on her. The old man did. He told the pilot. She felt a hand on her face and looked back down to see the old man touching her cheek. You're not a Jedi. Aliana shook her head. I'm a Sith Lord. Will you help? Aliana stared down at him, her heart racing. She tried to stay out of the war between the Republic and the First Order. Beyond a few odd jobs, she wasn't a desired ally for the Republic, and she'd decapitate herself before she considered joining the First Order. She always tried to help she had always tried to help wherever she could, but operating from the shadows and usually nothing big. Getting involved and helping in a way that the old man was asking would be stepping out of the sunlight. And sunlight was dangerous. Knowing she was probably going to get herself killed, she nodded. Yes, I will. The old man seemed to relax, and his hand slipped from her cheek. Thank you, Sith. His head lolled back, and his breathing became raspy and shallow. Knowing how much pain he was in, Aliana brought her lightsaber to his neck and quickly severed his head. She looked away from his body and started back toward her ship. She just promised to help, but now what was she supposed to do? As she was about to head up the ramp to the Fury, she spotted something out of the corner of her eye. A small divot in the sand that stretched out into the horizon. Something had been rolling out into the desert, something that had been here not too long ago. It was headed vaguely in the direction of Nima Outpost. With any luck, it would be there by tomorrow afternoon. With a new resolve, she got back into the Fury and prepared to return to the outpost. It looked like her stay on Jakku was going to be a little longer.